Dawn of determination. The morning air was heavy and damp as 10-year-old Amara woke to the muffled sounds of the city stirring to life. A sliver of pale sunlight filtered through the curtainless window, casting a soft glow across the cramped one-room apartment she shared with her mother. Amara sat up slowly, the threadbare blanket pooling around her thin shoulders. She shivered as the cold morning air touched her skin, but the chill wasn't enough to deter her. Across the room, her mother lay on a worn mattress, her frail body barely rising and falling with shallow breaths. Each labored inhale seemed to echo in the quiet room, a haunting reminder of the illness that gripped her mother's once vibrant spirit. Amara stared at her for a moment, her chest tightening. Her mother's face, once full of life and warmth, was now pale and drawn, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion even in sleep. Amara quietly slipped out of bed, her bare feet pressing against the cool concrete floor. She moved with practiced care, every step measured to avoid waking her mother. Her eyes caught the cracked jar on the kitchen counter, a makeshift savings bank that held a pitiful amount of coins. She bit her lip as she tiptoed past it, her mind swirling with worry. Today had to be different. Amara grabbed her bucket, the worn wooden handle rough against her palm. The rag and squeegee she painstakingly saved for were inside, tools she taught herself to use to clean car windows at intersections. Her father had been gone for years, and with her mother unable to work, the weight of survival had fallen squarely on her small shoulders. She adjusted her tattered sweater and pulled the apartment door closed behind her, leaving her mother to rest. The favelas of Sao Paulo were alive, even at this early hour. The narrow streets twisted like veins through the dense maze of buildings. People were beginning their daily routines, vendors setting up stalls, children chasing stray dogs, and women hanging laundry across rusted balconies. The air was a mix of familiar scents, damp concrete, freshly baked bread, and the faint tang of smoke from early morning cooking fires. Amara kept her head down as she weaved through the labyrinth of alleys, her bucket clanging softly with each step. The path she took was familiar, leading her to the bustling avenue, where the morning rush hour would soon reach its peak. The noise of the city grew louder with each step until she emerged onto the edge of the main road. This intersection was her workplace. She set down her bucket and took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the growing line of cars at the red light. The vehicles varied, some shiny and new, others battered and dusty, but their windows all shared one thing. They were streaked with the grime of city life. Amara dipped her squeegee into the bucket, letting the soapy water drip from its edge as she approached the first car. The driver, a young woman with sleek sunglasses, didn't even glance her way. She waved Amara off with a dismissive flick of her hand, her other hand gripping the steering wheel tightly. Amara nodded and stepped back, moving to the next car. Not interested. The next driver barked before she could even speak. Amara's chest tightened, but she swallowed the lump in her throat and forced her feet to keep moving. Each rejection chipped away at her confidence, but she had no choice but to press on. Her mother's frail face lingered in her mind, a constant reminder of why she was here. Finally, at the third car, a dusty hatchback with smudged windows, the driver nodded and rolled down the window. "Make it quick," the man said gruffly. Amara got to work, her small hands moving with precision as she cleaned the glass. The sun had begun to rise, its warmth cutting through the morning chill as it illuminated the streaks of soap she wiped away. By the time she finished, her arms were aching, but the glass was spotless. She stepped back, offering a polite smile as the driver handed her a coin through the window. It wasn't much, a single real, but it was something. The morning stretched on as Amara worked her way through the line of cars, her bucket gradually filling with dirty water. Some drivers were kind, offering her a smile or a small handful of coins. Others were harsh, their dismissive words stinging more than she cared to admit. By midday, her hands were raw from scrubbing, her legs heavy with exhaustion, but she couldn't afford to stop. When the traffic light turned red once more, Amara stepped toward a sleek black sedan, Her heart pounded as the driver's window rolled down, revealing a stern-looking man in a crisp police uniform. Officer Santiago. Amara froze. She'd seen him before, patrolling the streets with an air of authority that made her feel small and insignificant. She avoided him whenever she could, knowing that her work, though harmless, was technically against the law. "You again," Officer Santiago said, his deep voice cutting through the hum of the street. He stepped out of his car, his boots clicking against the pavement as he approached her. "I thought I told you to stay away from this intersection." Amara's stomach twisted. I'm not causing any trouble, sir," she stammered, clutching her squeaky tightly. Santiago's eyes narrowed as he looked her over, his expression unreadable. "This isn't safe for a kid like you," he said. "Do you even know what could happen out here?" Amara swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I don't have a choice, sir. My mom, she's sick. We need money for medicine, and this is the only way I can get it." For a moment, Santiago said nothing. His stern expression faltered, replaced by something softer, something Amara couldn't quite place. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he looked away. "Finish up here," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "But this is the last time. If I see you here again, you'll have to deal with the consequences." Amara nodded quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. Santiago turned and walked back to his car, leaving Amara standing there, her legs trembling. She watched him drive away, her chest heavy with a mix of relief and dread. The sun was setting by the time Amara made her way back home, her bucket nearly empty and her earnings barely enough to cover a loaf of bread. Her arms ached, her feet were blistered, and her chest felt tight with exhaustion, but she couldn't let herself fall apart. When she stepped through the door, her mother was still lying on the mattress, her eyes half open as she looked up weakly. "How was today, sweetie?" her mother rasped, her voice thin and strained. Amara forced a smile as she set down the bucket and knelt beside her. "It was okay," she lied, her voice cracking slightly. She opened the jar on the counter, dropping the coins inside with a soft clink. "We'll get more tomorrow." Her mother smiled faintly, her eyes fluttering closed. "You're a good girl, Amara," she whispered. "So strong, just like your father." Amara bit her lip, her chest heavy with unshed tears. She sat beside her mother, listening to her labored breathing as the room grew darker with the setting sun. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance, and she would fight for it with everything she had. Shadows of struggle. Amara woke to the sound of rain pattering softly against the window. The soft hum of water leaking through the cracks in the roof formed a steady rhythm that filled the small apartment. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she felt disoriented, unsure whether it was early morning or late night. The gray clouds outside blurred the distinction. Her mother's soft groan pulled her back to reality. Amara turned her head to see her mother shifting uncomfortably on the old mattress, her thin frame almost swallowed by the faded quilt covering her. The sight struck Amara anew with a pang of guilt. Her mother's once strong hands, which used to bake fresh bread and sew intricate designs into cloth, now trembled even as they lay still. "Mom," Amara whispered, crawling closer on the cold concrete floor. Her mother's eyes flickered open, the exhaustion etched deeply into her face. "Morning, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice raspier than the day before. "You're up early again." Amara managed a small smile. "I wanted to check on you. How are you feeling?" Her mother nodded faintly. "A little better," she lied. Amara saw right through it, but she didn't press her. They both knew the truth. The worsening coughs, the fevered nights, and the way her mother's strength seemed to drain away faster with each passing day. "I'll get us something today," Amara said with quiet determination, brushing a few stray curls out of her mother's damp forehead. Before her mother could protest, Amara grabbed her bucket and slipped out the door into the cool, rainy morning. The narrow streets of the favela were slick with water, the rain carving tiny rivers through the cracks in the pavement. People moved in hurried clusters, clutching umbrellas or pulling jackets tightly around themselves as they tried to avoid getting drenched. Amara pulled the hood of her sweater over her head, the fabric already soaked through in places. She clutched the bucket tightly, her hands trembling, not from the cold, but from the mounting dread of another day of work. The thought of facing Officer Santiago again, or worse, being hauled off by the authorities, made her stomach churn. But the thought of her mother's strained breaths and the faint hope of buying medicine outweighed every other fear. By the time Amara reached the intersection, the rain had eased into a light drizzle. Traffic was lighter than usual, but a steady stream of cars still filled the road. She set her bucket down, dipping her squeegee into the murky water. The first car rolled to a stop at the red light, a shiny white SUV with tinted windows. Amara approached cautiously, her squeegee raised slightly. She tapped on the driver's window, her polite smile plastered on her face. The window rolled down just enough for the driver's voice to carry through. "Not interested," the woman inside said curtly, before rolling it back up without waiting for a response. Amara nodded to herself, stepping back without a word. She moved on to the next car, a battered sit-in with grime-streaked windows. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, gave her a small nod. "Go ahead, but make it quick," he said, waving his hand vaguely. Amara sprang into action, her hands moving swiftly as she wiped away layers of dirt and streaks from the windshield. The rain had made her task harder, the soap and water mixing into a mess that refused to cooperate. Her hand slipped on the wet handle of the squeegee, and she almost dropped it, but she clenched her teeth and kept going. When she was done, the driver handed her a coin through the window. Amara thanked him quietly, her heart sinking as she realized it wasn't even enough to buy a loaf of bread. She slipped the coin into her pocket and moved on. The morning passed in much the same way, each rejection and meager earning adding to the weight pressing down on her small frame. The drizzle turned into a steady rain again, and Amara shivered as the cold seeped through her clothes. Her hands ached from the wet and the cold, her fingers stiff and raw from gripping the squeegee. Then she saw it, the familiar blue and white police car pulling up to the corner. Her heart stopped, her breath caught in her throat. Officer Santiago was back. Amara ducked behind a parked van, clutching her bucket to her chest as she watched the officer step out of his car. His boots splashed in the shallow puddles, and his stern gaze scanned the intersection. She didn't know if he was looking for her specifically, but she wasn't about to take the chance. She stayed hidden, her chest heaving as she tried to calm her racing heart. Santiago lingered for what felt like an eternity, talking into his radio and looking around before finally getting back into his car. Amara waited until the car was out of sight before stepping out from behind the van. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she considered packing up and leaving for the day. But the image of her mother's face flashed in her mind. Tired, pale, and weak. She couldn't go home empty-handed. Not again. She set her jaw and moved to the next car. By late afternoon, the rain had finally stopped, though the air was still damp and heavy. Amara had made just enough to buy a few rolls of bread and a small carton of milk. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She walked back through the favela, her steps slow and heavy with exhaustion. As she neared her home, she heard a familiar voice. Amara. She turned to see a small boy running toward her, his oversized jacket flapping around his thin frame. It was Joao, a neighbor who often helped her with errands when he wasn't at school. "What's wrong?" Amara asked, her heart sinking at the urgency in his voice. "It's your mom," Joao said, his face pale. "She's coughing really bad, and she can't stop. My mom sent me to find you." Amara's stomach dropped. She didn't wait for Joao to say anything else. She sprinted the rest of the way home, her bucket clattering to the ground as she ran. When she burst through the door, she found her mother hunched over on the mattress, her body racked with violent coughs. Her face was flushed, beads of sweat glistening on her forehead. "Mom!" Amara cried, rushing to her side. Her mother looked up, her eyes glassy with fever. "Amara," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm fine. Don't worry about me. You're not fine, Amara said, her voice trembling as she grabbed a damp cloth and pressed it to her mother's forehead. She didn't know what else to do. Her mother needed a doctor, medicine, things Amara couldn't afford. Tears stung her eyes as she sat beside her mother, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort. Her mind raced, desperate to think of a solution. Then she remembered Officer Santiago. He'd warned her to stay away from the intersection, but he'd also softened when she told him about her mother. Maybe, just maybe, he could help. Amara clenched her fists, determination rising within her. She didn't know if Santiago would listen, but she had to try. She couldn't lose her mother. As the rain began to fall again outside, Amara made a silent vow. She would fight for her mother, no matter what it took. A plea for help. The night seemed to stretch endlessly as Amara sat beside her mother, the dim light of a single bulb flickering faintly overhead. Her mother's breathing was shallow, a rasping sound that cut through the oppressive silence of their small apartment. The bread and milk Amara had managed to buy earlier sat untouched on the counter. Food wasn't what her mother needed now. She needed real care, medicine, and rest that wasn't constantly interrupted by coughing fits and fever dreams. Amara clenched her fists, the desperation curling tight in her chest, like a vine choking the life out of her resolve. She had to do something. No more waiting, no more hoping someone would notice their plight. She couldn't keep cleaning car windows and praying it would somehow be enough. Her gaze landed on her mother's frail figure, and a decision solidified in her mind. Tomorrow, she would find Officer Santiago. She didn't know what she would say, but she would make him listen. She needed help, and he was the only person with the power to make a difference. The next morning, Amara woke before dawn, her stomach twisting with nerves. She glanced at her mother, still asleep, her face pale and damp with sweat. Amara leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "I'll be back soon, Mom," she whispered, grabbing her backpack and slipping out the door. The air was damp and cold as Amara made her way through the twisting alleys of the favela. The faint light of the rising sun painted the streets in hues of gray and orange, but the beauty of the moment was lost on her. Her mind raced with worry and a flicker of hope as she replayed what she might say to Santiago. When she reached the intersection, she hesitated, her hands trembling. Traffic was just starting to pick up, the sound of engines rumbling through the stillness. Amara set her backpack down and scanned the street, searching for the familiar blue and white police car. She didn't have to wait long. The car pulled up to the corner, its tires splashing through a shallow puddle. Santiago stepped out, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the street with his usual stern expression. Amara's heart pounded as she mustered her courage and stepped forward. "Officer Santiago," she called, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. Santiago turned, his sharp gaze landing on her immediately. His brows furrowed as he walked toward her, his boots crunching on the wet pavement. "You again," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Didn't I tell you to stay away from this intersection?" Amara swallowed hard, standing her ground even as she felt her legs trembling. "I know, sir. I remember what you said," she replied, her voice firm but pleading. "But I need your help. Please." Santiago's expression softened slightly, though he didn't uncross his arms. "Help? What kind of help are you looking for, kid?" Amara took a deep breath, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "It's my mom. She's really sick, and I don't know what to do. I've been trying to earn money to buy her medicine, but it's not enough. I can't keep up, and she's getting worse." For a moment, Santiago said nothing. He studied her, his eyes narrowing as if he were weighing her words carefully. The tension in the air was palpable, and Amara felt her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Finally, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, kid, I'm not a doctor, and I can't fix everything. But I know someone who might be able to help. A friend of mine runs a shelter not far from here. They have a clinic, and they can give your mom the care she needs." Amara's eyes widened, hope sparking like a match in the darkness. "Really? You'd take me there?" Santiago nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Yes, but there's a condition. You have to promise me you'll stay off the streets. No more cleaning car windows. It's too dangerous out here, and I don't want to see you get hurt. Understand?" Amara nodded quickly, the words spilling from her lips. "I promise. I'll stop. Just please, help my mom." "Good," Santiago said. "Go get her. I'll drag you both to the shelter." Amara hesitated, glancing back toward the alley that led to her home. The thought of moving her mother, weak as she was, filled her with dread. But the alternative, doing nothing, wasn't an option. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice trembling. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, the maze of alleys blurring around her as she raced toward her apartment. When she burst through the door, her mother was awake, coughing into a rag that was now spotted with blood. The sight made Amara's heart clench, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Mom," she said, kneeling beside her, "I found someone who can help us, a police officer. He knows a place with doctors. They can take care of you." Her mother blinked at her, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Amara, you don't have to." "I do," Amara interrupted gently. "We can't wait anymore. Please, Mom, let me help you." With great effort, her mother nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, sweetie, if you think it's best." Amara helped her mother sit up, her frail body trembling with the effort. It took time, far more than Amara had anticipated, but eventually they were ready to go. Amara draped her mother's arm over her shoulder, supporting most of her weight as they made their way slowly through the narrow streets. When they reached the intersection, Santiago was waiting by his car. His stern expression softened as he saw Amara struggling to support her mother. Without a word, he stepped forward and gently helped her mother into the backseat of the police car. "Let's go," he said, his tone more gentle than Amara had ever heard it. The ride to the shelter was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional cough from Amara's mother. Amara sat in the backseat, holding her mother's hand tightly, her mind racing with questions. What if the clinic couldn't help? What if it was too late? When they arrived, Santiago helped her mother out of the car, guiding them into a modest building with a sign that read Hope Haven Shelter. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee. A nurse quickly approached, her face kind and concerned as she took in Amara's mother's condition. "We'll take care of her," the nurse said gently, guiding Amara's mother into a wheelchair. Amara watched as her mother was wheeled away, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and relief. She turned to Santiago, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Santiago nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're a tough kid, Amara. But remember what I said. No more cleaning car windows. Focus on your mom and yourself now. You've got people who want to help." Amara nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, there was hope. And that was enough. Hope amidst the chaos. Amara sat on a faded wooden bench outside the clinic room, her fingers tightly interlocked and her feet swinging slightly above the floor. The cold air conditioning chilled her damp clothes, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the door, where her mother had disappeared with the nurse and doctor almost an hour ago. The quiet hum of the shelter was broken occasionally by the sounds of conversation from the lobby or the distant clang of pots from the communal kitchen. She couldn't shake the nervous energy coursing through her body. She had never been in a place like this before, a haven of sorts in the chaotic and often unforgiving world she had grown up in. Officer Santiago had left after making sure her mother was admitted. His parting words, firm but filled with a strange warmth, still rang in her ears. "Stay here. Let them help you. Your mother's in good hands." He'd left without waiting for her thanks, but she silently vowed to prove to him that his effort wasn't wasted. The door finally opened, and the nurse who had taken her mother inside stepped out. She was a plump, middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calming presence. Amara immediately jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. "How is she?" Amara asked, her voice trembling with worry. The nurse placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a reassuring smile. "Your mother is stable for now," she said gently. "She's very weak, and her lungs are inflamed, but it's not too late to help her. She needs rest, proper nutrition, and regular medication to manage her symptoms." Amara nodded quickly, relief washing over her like a wave. "Can I see her?" "Of course. But just for a few minutes," the nurse said, guiding her into the room. Amara stepped inside, her eyes immediately landing on her mother, who was lying on a narrow bed with clean white sheets. Her face still looked pale, but there was a hint of color in her cheeks that hadn't been there in days. An IV drip hung beside her bed, and she was propped up slightly on a pillow. "Mom," Amara whispered, moving to her side. Her mother's eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Hey, sweetie," she murmured, her voice still weak but steadier than before. Amara took her mother's hand, her chest tightening as she fought back tears. "You're going to get better, Mom. The nurse said they'll take care of you here." Her mother nodded slowly. "I know, Amara," she said softly. "You're my brave girl. You've done so much for me. I'm proud of you." Amara bit her lip, unable to hold back the tears any longer. She leaned forward and rested her head on the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking as she cried quietly. Her mother's hand rested on her head, stroking her hair gently. "Don't cry, sweetie," her mother whispered. "We're going to be okay." After a few minutes, the nurse returned to the room and gently reminded Amara that her mother needed to rest. Amara reluctantly let go of her mother's hand, promising to visit her again soon. Amara stepped out into the main hall of the shelter, the reality of her situation settling in. Her mother would be taken care of here, but there was still so much to figure out. They couldn't stay here forever, and they had no home to return to without paying rent. The little money she had saved wouldn't last long. She wandered into the common area, where a few people sat around tables, talking in low voices or sipping cups of coffee. A young woman in her early 20s noticed her standing hesitantly by the door and waved her over. "Hey," the woman said, her voice cheerful despite the tired lines on her face. "You must be new here. I'm Sophia." Amara hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "I'm Amara," she said softly. Sophia gestured to an empty chair beside her. "Sit. You look like you've had a rough couple of days." Amara sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "My mom's sick. She's in the clinic," she explained. Sophia nodded, her expression sympathetic. "This place is good. They'll take care of her. I've been here for a few months now. It's not perfect, but it's better than being out there." Amara glanced at her, curious. "Why are you here?" Sophia's smile faltered slightly, but she shrugged. "Life happened. My parents passed away, and I couldn't keep up with rent. I ended up here after sleeping on the streets for a while. Now I work in the kitchen, and they let me stay as long as I pull my weight." "You work here?" Amara asked, her interest piqued. "Yeah," Sophia said. "It's part of how this place operates. They give you food, a roof over your head, and some support, but they also ask you to contribute if you're able. Helps keep things running and gives you a purpose." Amara thought about that. She had spent the past months scrubbing car windows for a few coins, feeling invisible and powerless. But here, maybe she could do something more meaningful. "Do you think I could work here too?" Amara asked tentatively. Sophia tilted her head, studying her. "Maybe. You're young, but you seem determined. Talk to Mr. Ferreira. He's the shelter manager. He's strict, but he's fair. If you explain your situation, he might give you a chance." Amara didn't waste any time. She found Mr. Ferreira in his office later that afternoon. He was a tall, older man with a salt and pepper beard and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "What can I do for you, young lady?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Amara took a deep breath, standing as tall as she could. "My mom is in the clinic, and we don't have anywhere else to go. I want to work here. I can clean, cook, or do whatever you need." Ferreira leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him. "You're awfully young to be asking for work," he said. "I know," Amara said quickly, "but I'm not afraid of hard work. I've been taking care of my mom and earning money for us for months now. I need a chance." Ferreira was silent for a moment, his gaze piercing. Then he nodded. "All right, we'll start you in the kitchen with Sophia. If you prove yourself, we'll see about giving you more responsibility." Amara's heart soared. "Thank you, Mr. Ferreira. I won't let you down." Her first day in the kitchen was harder than she expected. Sophia handed her an apron and showed her how to chop vegetables, scrub pots, and portion out meals for the shelter residents. The work was exhausting, her arms aching from scrubbing and her fingers sore from slicing, but she didn't complain. By the end of the day, Amara was covered in flour and grease, but there was a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in a long time. She had earned her place here, and with every task she completed, she felt a little stronger. When she returned to the clinic that evening, her mother was awake and smiling faintly. "How was it?" her mother asked, her voice still weak but filled with curiosity. Amara sat beside her, taking her hand. "It was hard," she admitted, "but it felt good. I think we're going to be okay, Mom." Her mother squeezed her hand gently, her smile growing. "I never doubted you for a second," she said. Amara stayed by her mother's side until she fell asleep, the weight on her chest lifting just a little. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like they were moving toward something better. It wasn't going to be easy, but Amara had never been afraid of hard work. She would fight for their future, one step at a time, building a new life. Amara's days at the shelter became a whirlwind of activity. Each morning, she woke early, her small frame energized by a renewed sense of purpose. She would check on her mother first thing, offering a warm smile and gentle words before heading to the kitchen. Sophia was always there, already bustling about, her cheerful demeanor infectious despite the challenging work. "Morning, champ," Sophia greeted one day, sliding a tray of vegetables onto the counter. "Think you can handle chopping these without taking a finger off?" Amara laughed, grabbing a knife. "I think I've got it down by now," she replied, her hands deftly working through the pile. The routine was grueling but rewarding. Amara worked in the kitchen, helped clean common areas, and even assisted with sorting donations that came in sporadically from local charities. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward reclaiming the stability she and her mother had lost. But the work wasn't without its challenges. Some days, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Her muscles ached from scrubbing floors, her hands were blistered from carrying heavy trays, and there were moments when the weight of her responsibilities made her want to collapse. It was during one of these particularly difficult days that Mr. Ferreira approached her in the dining hall. He leaned against the counter, watching her scrub a stubborn stain off a pot. "You've been working hard, Amara," he said, his voice cutting through the clatter of dishes. She looked up, her face flushed from the effort. "I'm just trying to do my part," she said, standing straighter despite her fatigue. Ferreira nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're doing more than your part. I've seen how you've taken to the work here, and it hasn't gone unnoticed. I wanted to talk to you about something." Amara wiped her hands on her apron, her heart quickening. "What is it?" "We're starting a new program for young people at the shelter," Ferreira explained. "An apprenticeship program. It's meant to teach skills, cooking, maintenance, sewing, things that can help you find stable work when you're ready to leave here." Amara's eyes widened. "You mean I could learn something real, like a trade?" Ferreira smiled faintly. "Exactly. You've shown you're responsible, and I think you'd do well in the program. I wanted to offer you a spot." Amara's heart swelled with hope. "Thank you, Mr. Ferreira. I'd love to do it," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Good," Ferreira said, nodding in approval. "We'll start you in the kitchen since you've already got some experience there. But remember, this is a commitment. It's going to be tough, and you'll have to balance it with your other responsibilities." "I can do it," Amara said firmly. The apprenticeship began the following week, and true to Ferreira's warning, it was intense. Amara spent hours learning not just how to cook, but how to manage inventory, plan meals, and even handle basic accounting. The head cook, Donna Clara, was a stern but patient teacher, her decades of experience evident in every lesson she gave. "Cooking isn't just about throwing things together," Clara said one day, showing Amara how to knead dough. "It's about precision, timing, and care. If you can master those things, you can make something out of even the simplest ingredients." Amara took every word to heart, throwing herself into the work with unwavering determination. She stayed late some nights, practicing knife skills, or studying recipes Clara had given her. Her hands became calloused, her muscles stronger, and her confidence grew with each passing day. Sophia often teased her about her newfound ambition. "Look at you," she said one evening, watching Amara chop onions with practiced efficiency. "Next thing you know, you'll be running this place." Amara laughed, but the thought lingered. For the first time, she dared to dream about a future beyond mere survival. Amara's progress in the kitchen wasn't the only bright spot in her life. Her mother's condition was improving, thanks to the care she received in the shelter's clinic. The nurses ensured she had regular meals, medication, and a comfortable place to rest. One afternoon, Amara returned to the clinic to find her mother sitting up in bed, her cheeks rosy and her eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. "Mom," Amara exclaimed, rushing to her side. "You're sitting up." Her mother smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm feeling stronger today," she said. "The nurses here are wonderful. And you've been doing so much for us." Amara beamed, her chest swelling with pride. "I'm learning so much, Mom. I'm in a program now, and they're teaching me how to cook and manage a kitchen. One day, I'll be able to get a real job and take care of us properly." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "You're amazing, Amara. I don't know how I got so lucky to have a daughter like you." Amara shook her head, her throat tightening. "You taught me everything, Mom. I'm just doing what you would do if you could." They sat together for a while, the bond between them stronger than ever. Months passed, and Amara's life continued to transform. She excelled in her apprenticeship, earning praise from Clara and Ferreira for her dedication. She even began helping Sophia with the shelter's events, preparing meals for fundraisers and community gatherings. One evening after a particularly successful event, Ferreira called Amara into his office. "You've done incredible work here, Amara," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I'm proud of how far you've come." "Thank you," Amara said, her voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without this place." Ferreira leaned forward, his expression serious. "I think it's time we start talking about the future. There's a restaurant in town, small, family-owned. They're looking for someone to help in the kitchen, and I've recommended you for the position." Amara's heart skipped a beat. "A job," she whispered, barely able to believe it. Ferreira nodded. "It won't be easy, but it's a chance to start building a life outside the shelter. You've earned it." Tears filled Amara's eyes as she realized what this meant, not just for her but for her mother. They could rebuild together. "Thank you, Mr. Ferreira," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." The next day, Amara shared the news with her mother, who hugged her tightly despite her lingering weakness. "I always knew you'd do something amazing, Amara," her mother said, her voice filled with pride. As Amara held her mother, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. It hadn't been easy, but every challenge had shaped her into the strong, capable person she was becoming. And this was just the beginning. Rising above, Amara stood in front of the small restaurant, her heart pounding in her chest. The sign above the door read La Familia Bistro, the letters painted in a warm, welcoming script. The smell of garlic, fresh herbs, and simmering sauces wafted through the air, making her stomach rumble despite her nerves. She clutched the worn slip of paper Mr. Ferreira had given her with the restaurant's address and a handwritten note of recommendation. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. A small bell chimed, and she stepped inside. The interior was cozy, with mismatched chairs and tables covered in colorful tablecloths. Photos of smiling families and rustic Italian landscapes lined the walls. The hum of conversation filled the room, along with the occasional clink of dishes and laughter from the kitchen. A woman in her 50s with graying curls and an apron tied around her waist approached her, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice warm and friendly. Amara cleared her throat, her grip tightening on the paper. "I'm Amara," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Mr. Ferreira from the shelter said you're looking for someone to help in the kitchen." Recognition flickered in the woman's eyes. Yes. Ferreira spoke highly of you. I'm Rosa, the owner," she said, extending her hand. Amara shook it, feeling some of her tension ease. Rosa's grip was firm but kind. "Come with me," Rosa said, leading her toward the back. "Let's see what you can do." The kitchen was bustling with energy. Pans sizzled on the stove, knives chopped against wooden boards, and the smell of baking bread filled the air. Rosa introduced her to Marco, the head chef, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and a booming laugh. "She's green, but Ferreira says she's a hard worker," Rosa told him, clapping Amara on the shoulder. Marco eyed her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he handed her an apron and pointed to a pile of vegetables on the counter. "Show me how you chop," he said simply. Amara's hands shook slightly as she picked up the knife, but she focused on what Clara had taught her. She steadied herself and began slicing the carrots with precision, making sure each piece was uniform. Marco leaned over to inspect her work, then grunted in approval. "Not bad," he said. "Let's see if you can handle a sauce next." The rest of the day flew by as Amara moved through the tasks Marco assigned her. She prepped ingredients, stirred pots, and even plated a few dishes under his watchful eye. By the time the evening rush began, her arms were aching, and her feet felt like lead, but she didn't care. When the last table was served, Rosa pulled her aside. "You did well today," Rosa said, her smile genuine. "Marco doesn't praise just anyone, you know." Amara's cheeks flushed with pride. "Thank you for giving me a chance," she said. "We'll start you part-time for now," Rosa said. "Come back tomorrow, and we'll talk about scheduling." Amara nodded eagerly, gratitude welling up inside her. When Amara returned to the shelter that night, she practically ran to the clinic to tell her mother the news. Her mother was sitting up in bed, her face brighter than it had been in weeks. "How was it, sweetie?" her mother asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Amara beamed as she sat beside her. "I got the job, Mom," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "They're starting me part-time, but it's real. It's a real job." Tears filled her mother's eyes as she reached out to take Amara's hands. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice cracking. "You've worked so hard for this." Amara hugged her mother tightly, feeling a deep sense of relief and joy. The following weeks were a blur of hard work and adjustment. Amara split her time between the shelter and the restaurant, juggling her shifts with her responsibilities at the shelter. Marco continued to challenge her, teaching her more complex techniques and pushing her to improve. "You've got potential, kid," Marco said one day as they worked side by side. "But talent isn't enough. You've got to work for it every single day." "I will," Amara promised, her determination shining through. Her confidence grew with each shift, and soon she found herself taking on more responsibilities in the kitchen. She learned how to prepare sauces from scratch, bake bread, and even manage the chaos of the dinner rush. The work was demanding, but she thrived under the pressure. Rosa often checked in on her, offering encouragement and advice. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," Rosa said one evening as they closed up. "Hungry for a better life. Ready to fight for it. Don't lose that fire, Amara." At the shelter, Amara's progress inspired others. Sophia often teased her about becoming a famous chef, but her pride in Amara was clear. Even Mr. Ferreira, usually stoic, praised her determination during a staff meeting. But the person most inspired by Amara's journey was her mother. Under the care of the shelter's clinic, her health had improved significantly. She was no longer bedridden and had started helping with small tasks around the shelter. "You're my strength, Amara," her mother said one evening as they sat together in the clinic. "Watching you fight for us gives me the will to keep going." Amara squeezed her mother's hand, her heart full of love and gratitude. "We're doing this together, Mom, one step at a time." Months turned into a year, and Amara's life continued to evolve. She became a full-time employee at La Familia Bistro, earning enough to move her mother into a modest apartment near the shelter. Rosa and Marco remained her mentors, helping her refine her skills and encouraging her to dream bigger. One evening, as she prepared a new dish in the restaurant's kitchen, Marco handed her a piece of paper. "What's this?" Amara asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's a flyer for a culinary school," Marco said. "Rosa and I think you should apply. You've got the talent, Amara, and you've got the drive. This could be your next step." Amara stared at the flyer, her mind racing. The thought of attending culinary school had never crossed her mind. It felt like something out of reach, meant for people with money and connections. "Do you really think I could do it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marco placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression firm. "I know you can. You've already come this far, haven't you?" Amara nodded, her heart pounding. She thought of her mother, the shelter, and all the people who had believed in her when she'd felt invisible. This was her chance to rise even further. As she left the restaurant that night, the flyer clutched tightly in her hand. Amara looked up at the star-filled sky. Her journey had been full of challenges, but she had risen above them all. And now she was ready to take the next step toward a future she never thought possible. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving, about proving to herself and the world that no matter where she came from, she could achieve anything. A new horizon. The morning sunlight streamed through the modest curtains of their new apartment, casting warm patterns across the floor. Amara stood by the small kitchen counter, her hands trembling slightly as she looked down at the application form for Instituto Gastronómico de São Paulo, one of the most respected culinary schools in the region. The crisp paper seemed to radiate possibility, but it also carried the weight of everything she had worked so hard for. Her mother, now healthier and stronger, walked into the room, her steps slow but steady. She had regained much of her strength in the months since they moved out of the shelter. Her cheeks were fuller, and her voice no longer carried the frailty that once worried Amara every day. "Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" her mother teased, sitting down at the small dining table. Amara smiled nervously, holding up the application. "It's just, this feels huge, Mom. What if I'm not ready? What if I can't do it?" Her mother reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Amara's. "You've faced far worse. Amara, this is just another step. Remember what Mr. Ferreira always said. If you work hard enough, you can accomplish anything." Amara took a deep breath, nodding. "You're right. I can do this." The application process. Over the next few weeks, Amara poured herself into the application process. The school required not only personal information, but also an essay describing her journey and why she wanted to pursue culinary arts. Writing the essay proved to be both a challenge and a revelation. As she recounted her struggles, her mother's illness, the nights cleaning car windows, the shelter, and her growth at La Familia Bistro, she realized just how far she had come. Sophia helped her edit the essay, her sharp wit making the process less daunting. "Don't hold back," Sophia said, peering over Amara's shoulder. "Your story is powerful. Let them see who you really are." By the time she submitted the application, Amara felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The waiting period was agonizing. Each day at the restaurant felt longer, her nerves fraying every time she checked her email for a response. Then, one afternoon, while prepping sauces in the restaurant's kitchen, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with trembling hands and saw the subject line: "Congratulations on your acceptance." Her heart stopped. For a moment, she could barely breathe. She opened the email, her eyes scanning the words that confirmed her acceptance into the culinary program. "I got in," she shouted, her voice echoing through the kitchen. Rosa and Marco turned, their faces breaking into wide smiles. Rosa hugged her tightly, flour smudging onto Amara's apron. "I knew you would, Corita. This is just the beginning." Culinary school begins. The first day at the Instituto Gastronómico de São Paulo was nothing short of overwhelming. The school was a sprawling campus, its state-of-the-art kitchens gleaming under fluorescent lights. Students bustled about in crisp white uniforms, their knives and tools meticulously arranged in their kits. Amara stood at the entrance, clutching her bag and taking it all in. She felt out of place among the confident chatter of students who spoke of culinary internships in Europe and family-run restaurants. But when she stepped into the classroom and donned her chef's jacket for the first time, something clicked. This was where she belonged. Her first challenge was a knife skills test, and as she began chopping vegetables, under the watchful eye of Chef Morales, the stern instructor who oversaw her group, she could feel her nerves start to fade. Clara and Marco's lessons had prepared her well, and by the end of the session, Morales gave her a curt nod of approval. "Not bad for your first day," he said. "Keep practicing." Amara grinned, her confidence growing with each passing moment, balancing school and work. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest Amara had ever faced. Balancing culinary school with her job at La Familia Bistro and her responsibilities at home left her with little time to rest. She often stayed up late, studying recipes and techniques under the dim light of their apartment's kitchen. Her mother, ever her cheerleader, often joined her, offering gentle encouragement as Amara practiced plating dishes or perfected the delicate art of tempering chocolate. "You've always had a gift," her mother said one night, watching as Amara carefully piped frosting onto a cake. "But now you're turning it into something extraordinary." At the restaurant, Marco noticed her growing skill and began giving her more creative freedom. "Why don't you create the special for tomorrow?" he suggested one evening. Amara's eyes widened. "Really? You trust me with that?" Marco chuckled. "You've earned it. Show me what you've got." Amara worked late into the night, crafting a dish inspired by her mother's cooking, an herb-crusted chicken paired with a zesty orange reduction and sautéed vegetables. When the dish was served the next day, it quickly became a customer favorite. Rosa pulled her aside after the dinner rush, her eyes shining with pride. "That was incredible, Amara. You're going places, and I'm proud to have you here." Recognition and a new opportunity. As the months passed, Amara began to stand out at culinary school. Her instructors praised her creativity and resilience, often citing her ability to adapt under pressure. She built friendships with fellow students, many of whom were inspired by her story. One day, during a guest lecture by a renowned chef, Amara's work caught the attention of the speaker, Chef Lorenzo. He was a tall, charismatic man known for his Michelin-starred restaurant in Rio de Janeiro. After tasting one of her dishes, a deconstructed feijoada with a modern twist, he approached her. "This is exceptional," he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You have a unique perspective. Where did you learn to cook like this?" Amara blushed, explaining her journey from the streets to the shelter and eventually to the Instituto Gastronómico. Chef Lorenzo smiled. I'm hosting a competition in a few months for young chefs. The winner earns an internship at my restaurant. I think you should apply. The competition. The announcement of the competition sent a ripple of excitement through the school. Students from all over Sao Paulo prepared to showcase their skills, and the pressure was immense. Amara knew this was her chance to prove herself, not just to the judges, but to everyone who had ever doubted her. For weeks, she practiced tirelessly, refining her dish, a contemporary take on moqueca, a Brazilian seafood stew. She poured her heart into every element, from the perfectly cooked seafood to the bold yet balanced flavors of the coconut lime broth. When the day of the competition arrived, Amara stood in the kitchen, her hands steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd outside, and the clinking of utensils as the other competitors prepared their dishes. As she plated her final dish, she thought of her mother, Rosa, Marco, Sophia, and everyone else who had supported her. This was more than a competition. It was a culmination of everything she had fought for. Victory and a new chapter. The judges tasted each dish, their expressions revealing little as they deliberated. When the head judge finally stood to announce the winner, Amara held her breath. The winner of this year's competition, earning an internship at Lorenzo's, is Amara Santos. The room erupted into applause as Amara's name was called. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped forward to accept the award. She had done it. As Amara stood on the stage, the weight of her journey hit her. From the girl scrubbing car windows on the streets of Sao Paulo to a rising star in the culinary world, she had defied the odds. Her mother was waiting for her in the audience, clapping with pride. Amara met her gaze, her heart full. This was only the beginning. Her dreams were no longer out of reach. They were within her grasp, and she was ready to soar. A dream realized. The night air in Rio de Janeiro was alive with energy as Amara stepped into the grand entrance of Lorenzo's, the Michelin-starred restaurant that was now her workplace. The sleek, modern design of the space was a stark contrast to the cozy warmth of La Familia Bistro, but it carried the same hum of passion and excellence she had come to admire. She paused at the threshold of the kitchen, her heart racing. It was her first official day as an intern, and the weight of the opportunity pressed heavily on her shoulders. The competition had opened a door to a world she had once thought unattainable, but stepping through it now felt daunting. Inside, the kitchen was a symphony of movement and sound. Chefs in pristine white jackets moved with precision, their knives slicing through ingredients like butter. Pans sizzled, timers beeped, and commands were shouted over the din. Amara's pulse quickened. "You must be Amara," a familiar voice called out. She turned to see Chef Lorenzo himself, his tall frame commanding but approachable. His sharp eyes scanned her, but there was a flicker of encouragement in his gaze. "Yes, chef," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Welcome to my kitchen," Lorenzo said, gesturing to the bustling space around him. "This isn't just a restaurant, it's a machine, and every person here is a vital part of it. Today, you're starting on prep. Show me what you've got." Amara nodded, her determination blazing. "I won't let you down, chef." Finding her rhythm. Amara's first weeks at Lorenzo's were some of the most challenging of her life. She arrived hours before the restaurant opened, working alongside the prep team to ensure every ingredient was perfect. Every task, no matter how small, demanded her full attention. Slicing truffles paper thin, mincing herbs to an exact consistency, or ensuring every piece of seafood was impeccably fresh. She learned quickly that mistakes were not tolerated. One day, she accidentally over-seasoned a broth, and Lorenzo's critique was swift and cutting. "Attention to detail is everything, Amara," he said, his tone sharp. "A single misstep can ruin an entire dish, and the trust our customers place in us." Amara nodded, swallowing her disappointment. But instead of letting the critique crush her, she let it fuel her resolve. She spent her evenings reviewing her notes and practicing at home. She pored over culinary books borrowed from the restaurant's library, her mind buzzing with techniques and flavor profiles. Slowly but surely, her confidence grew. She moved from prep to working the line, her station a whirlwind of activity as she plated appetizers and assisted with entrees. Each night, she walked home exhausted but exhilarated, her heart swelling with pride as she recounted the day's victories to her mother over the phone. A visit from the past. One evening, as Amara prepped for service, Chef Lorenzo approached her with a rare smile. "You've got visitors," he said, nodding toward the dining room. Amara frowned, confused, but quickly wiped her hands and stepped out of the kitchen. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw her mother, Sofia, Rosa, and Marco sitting at a corner table, their faces lit with excitement. "Surprise," Sofia called, waving her napkin in the air. Amara's mother stood, beaming with pride. "We couldn't wait any longer to see you in action," she said, pulling Amara into a warm hug. Amara's eyes filled with tears as she embraced each of them in turn. Seeing them here, in this elegant restaurant that represented her hard-fought dreams, felt surreal. "Are you ready to impress us?" Marco teased, his grin wide. "You'll be eating the best dishes on the menu tonight," Amara replied with a laugh, wiping her eyes. Back in the kitchen, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every dish she sent out to their table was crafted with care, her hands steady and her heart full. She peeked out occasionally, her chest swelling with pride as she watched them savor the food she had prepared. At the end of the evening, Rosa pulled her aside, her eyes glistening. "You've always been special, Amara," she said. "But seeing you here, it's something else entirely. We're so proud of you." Rising to the challenge. As months turned into a year, Amara became an integral part of Lorenzo's team. She mastered each station in the kitchen, earning the respect of her peers and the approval of Lorenzo himself. One evening, during a particularly hectic service, a dish for a VIP guest was nearly ruined when another chef overcooked the main component. Without hesitation, Amara stepped in, reworking the dish on the fly and presenting it with a flawless finish. When Lorenzo tasted it before sending it out, he raised an eyebrow. "You saved us tonight," he said, a rare smile tugging at his lips. That moment marked a turning point. Amara was no longer just an intern. She was a chef. The call to leadership. A few months later, Lorenzo pulled Amara aside after service. His expression was thoughtful as he handed her a small leather-bound notebook. "What's this?" she asked, flipping it open to find neatly written notes and sketches of dishes. "My ideas for a new concept," Lorenzo said. "I'm opening a second restaurant, and I want you to be part of it, not as a line cook, but as the sous chef." Amara's breath caught in her throat. "Sous chef," she repeated, barely able to believe it. "You've earned it," Lorenzo said. "Your creativity, your resilience, your ability to lead under pressure, it's exactly what I need for this project." Tears welled in Amara's eyes as she nodded. "Thank you, chef. I won't let you down." A celebration of triumph. The news of her promotion spread quickly, and her loved ones gathered to celebrate. They met at La Familia Bistro, where Rosa insisted on hosting a dinner in Amara's honor. The restaurant buzzed with warmth and laughter as Amara sat surrounded by the people who had shaped her journey. Her mother, now healthy and vibrant, raised a glass of sparkling water. "To Amara," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "for never giving up, no matter how hard it got. You've shown us all what it means to be truly strong." Sofia grinned, adding, "and for being the only person who can make me cry over a bowl of soup." Amara laughed, her cheeks flushing with gratitude. As she looked around the table, her heart swelled. Each person here had been a part of her story, a story of resilience, love, and the power of hope. Looking ahead. In the years that followed, Amara's career flourished. The new restaurant, Essentia, became a resounding success, earning critical acclaim for its innovative take on Brazilian cuisine. As sous chef, Amara worked tirelessly alongside Lorenzo, crafting menus that celebrated her roots while pushing culinary boundaries. But she never forgot where she came from. She often returned to the shelter to mentor young people, sharing her story and teaching them the skills she had learned. One day, as she stood in front of a group of aspiring chefs, she smiled and said, "Your circumstances don't define you. Your strength, your determination, and your willingness to keep going, those are what make you who you are." Her words, like her journey, were a testament to the power of perseverance. Amara had not only risen above her struggles, she had soared, and her story was far from over.